Good morning and good afternoon for some of you. Welcome to our webinar about release management on Salesforce. This is the first of two webinars where we will be discussing all things related to application lifecycle management on Salesforce. And let me just pause real quick. Application lifecycle management is something you'll hear throughout. That is a term that we here in Salesforce use interchangeably with release and change management in Salesforce. This is our safe harbor slide. It's added to all of our slide decks that are customer facing. So there's a whole bunch of information here, but simply put, no matter what we talk about, you must make sure that if you are in a position to buy our products, you must make that decision based on the features and functionality that are generally available, not because of some future capability or a comment that was made in a presentation like this. Good news though, the content in this deck is based on features and functionality that are all already generally available in our product, so we don't really have to worry about this. So now that the legal business is out of the way, let me introduce myself. My name is John Vogt. I am a product manager in our platform organization, and I own the Sandbox product. Now, a little bit about this webinar. It will be recorded and added to YouTube, so you can watch it as many times as you would like. That said, all of our webinars are recorded and added to YouTube, and you can get more information on them through any of these social media outlets or on the web at developer.force.com. So, looking at our agenda, starting out, I'll give an overview of the webinar so you have an idea of what we will cover. We'll then get to the bulk of the content through the story about customization. I'll follow that with a recap, a Q&A session, and then next steps. Okay, so for this webinar, we are going to be taking you through a story about application lifecycle management in Salesforce. Our customer will be working through the first iterations of customization and deployment using the Salesforce platform. So along the way, during the story, you'll learn best practices, recommended tools, as well as the typical pitfalls that we see for this type of customer in early stages and how to avoid them. So let's just jump into our story. First thing, let's get to know a bit about our fake company. So Acme Company just bought Salesforce Enterprise Edition. They have a small IT department or dev team. They only own the out-of-the-box developer sandbox that comes bundled with Enterprise Edition. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with sandboxes, a developer sandbox is a Salesforce organization created in our test infrastructure. These things are built for you to develop and test customizations outside of your production Salesforce org. Now, this particular customer has typical Sales Cloud needs, but for this demonstration, they need to customize and create their own order workflow so they can give their sales reps the best user experience possible to track all the specific data to their company. Now, two things about this story and this demonstration. This is not going to be about how to create and build out a Visualforce page or an Apex class. The classes and objects that you'll see will be shells of what would normally be full, robust, developed classes. We build only enough to suit the purpose of this exercise, which is to tell you about release management. It is also extremely important that you pay attention to the company profile that I just gave. We have designed this webinar specifically for this type of company. Now, we know we're going to have lots of different types of people dialing in, coming from different companies of different profiles. So just understand, and I'll explain more about the second webinar later, that if this webinar doesn't completely fit what you would expect or your profile, the second webinar most likely will. And I should also add the second is an evolution of this one. So this is still great content and a great starting point for you. Okay, a bit about org customization for Acme. So what are some of the best practices that we would give to this type of customer? So if possible, stay in the browser. And so what do I mean by that? Well, we do offer some desktop tooling, but if you're using all of our browser-based tools, you are really ready to go from day one. There aren't any extra product downloads. You can go right into your org and start customizing. You also don't have to worry about upgrading your tooling after every major release. That said, if you are doing development in the browser, I would say our recommendation is to use the developer console. Now, there are still multiple development type tools available, but this tool is your one-stop shop in the browser for creating Visualforce, Apex, triggers. There's some other features, and there's part of the demonstration where I showed Dev Console later, so I'll show you a little bit more then. I would also say that if we're talking about release management and we're saying stay in the browser, then our recommended tool, which we'll be highlighting in this demonstration, is change sets. Now, for the size of the development and IT group that we see with this company, we are also saying to do as much as you can with point-and-click development. Now, there are two great reasons for this. First of all, you'll be able to customize at a more rapid pace. Development requires a bit of a learning curve, and even if you have developers that already understand Apex and Visualforce, there's still an added bit of testing that goes along with creating these types of customizations. Secondly, with point-and-click, you don't always have to rely on the developer to get things done. This is one of the most powerful things about the Salesforce platform. Any business user can pick up on how to use the point-and-click capabilities. So in the end, when you start working with Salesforce, you may find that you end up with a larger development team than you expected. Last but certainly not least, strive to do as much development in the Sandbox org as you can. You have this product with Enterprise Edition. It's there for you to use. Make the best of it. Do not make changes directly in production unless there is no other way or unless time is of the essence. I would say the main reason for this is to isolate the changes from your the main reason to use the Sandbox is so you are isolated from the day-to-day activities that the rest of your business users will be doing in the production org. Working in the developer Sandbox gives you the peace of mind that you can develop and test without affecting your core and critical business operations. They also give you an added benefit that you can isolate certain types of users. For instance, a lot of customers hire third parties or contractors to come in and do their customization. Some of these customers can't allow someone to work directly in the production org due to data security or data sensitivity issues. So using the Sandbox can isolate them and keep them out of the important data. So let's get into our demonstration. In the first part of our demonstration, we're going to use a Sandbox to create some custom objects, Apex classes, and Visualforce pages. And then we'll walk through how to use change sets to upload the changes to the production org and then deploy them so they take place for use in your production org. Let's switch over to our browser. Now, in this left tab I'm logged into my production instance as an admin user. And in the right tab, I'm already logged into my Sandbox. So I'll be flipping back and forth between these tabs as we go. So like I said, before we get in the Sandbox org, let me walk through the Sandbox interface so you know how to create the development environment. So to create a Sandbox, go and use this drop-down under Admin User and select Setup. And then navigate over here to the Quick Find search bar and start typing in Sandbox. This is typically the quickest way people get to this area. You'll see sandboxes under data management on the left. Click onto that. And this will take you to the main sandbox page. Now, what you initially see here is that we are highlighted with the Sandboxes tab first. And then at the top of the screen, you'll see your available Sandbox licenses. Now, these licenses give you the ability to create Sandbox products. The developer Sandbox, in particular, is the most lightweight of our products, ideally used by one developer as their own playground. Now, as I've said, we're only using one Sandbox in this demonstration, and for a lot of customers, this is the only Sandbox they have. So in those cases, it's still okay to use developer sandboxes with multiple people or even a team, but if you can get to it, ideally one per person. Developer sandbox, what it is, it comes with just the metadata from the production org. So we make a copy of the production org's metadata and create a new org in our sandbox infrastructure. Now, what's included in that metadata are object definitions, code, layouts, custom settings, but there is no object data in the developer sandbox. Now, the configuration sandbox is somewhat of just a step up from the dev. It offers all the same functionality. The only difference between the two is it has a larger storage limit. So that can be useful for creating more robust test data sets that you use for QA use cases or maybe training. Then you have our full sandbox. This is our flagship product, which is a replica of your production org. That said, it includes all the metadata and all the data in your production org. The best use cases for full sandbox are for performance, scalability, as well as using it as a staging environment. This is typically, when they have it, the customer's last area for validation before pushing changes to production. Now, to create a sandbox, you simply click on this new sandbox button right here in the middle of the page. Now, that'll take you to the beginning of a wizard. And right now, if you look at the bottom, you can see that I don't have any developer licenses available. I do have 2 configuration licenses available. So just for the demonstration, I'm going to create a configuration-only sandbox. We'll call this config. And then once you have a name and a description in there, actually I'll call it QA. You just click create. And what that does is it enqueues a request into our sandbox copy queue, which will be handled in order. The copy queues are shared by multiple customers, so that it's not instantaneous. And when that is finished copying and finished creating, you'll get an email letting you know that it's ready for use. So we're not going to obviously wait for that one. That could take some time, so we're going to go ahead and start working in our developer sandbox. So switching over to the right tab, once we are logged in, we can begin our customization. So similar to what you would do in the production org. In the sandbox org, you click on admin user, select setup, and you can start to do your customization. Now I'm not going to go through and recreate everything here. I already have some stuff. So let me show you what we've got. So like I said, remember, we're building a custom order flow for Acme companies. So to store this information, we created a custom object called Acme order. And to expose this information, we have a Visualforce page, which takes you through the order flow, and we have an Apex class that we are using as a controller. Now, all of these, like I said, all of these artifacts will be used to create the custom order flow. At this point, I want to show you Developer Console, what it looks like, what you can get out of it, and I'll show you how to create a simple Visualforce page. So if you want to use Dev Console, just like you're going to Setup, use the Admin User dropdown, select Developer Console, and a window will pop up giving you a workspace for developing a set of things. And what you have access to here, as you can see as I'm scrolling through File, New, you can create an Apex class, an Apex trigger, a Visualforce page, or a Visualforce component. Now you can do this all in one place, which is the power of this tool. The other things you have debug tooling right in this browser window. You have tools for testing your Apex classes and triggers, and you have the ability to use workspaces, which essentially allows you to flip back and forth between groups of development that you're doing. Okay? So I'm going to close out the Dev Console. All right, so at this point in time, we've finished our first customization. We have our Visualforce page, that's our order flow, and everything's all set. We've already gone through test and validation here in the Sandbox. So now we have to push this stuff to the production org. So how do we do that? We use change sets. Now, how do we start using change sets? Well, the first thing you need to know about are deployment connections. Now, deployment connections were created so an administrator could explicitly define which orgs in their Salesforce universe could talk to each other through our metadata API tools, change sets being one of them. This allows the sysadmin or release manager to control the release path and movement of code and configuration between each org in their Salesforce universe. So these deployment connections are very useful when you have multiple sandboxes at your disposal. So let's show you the deployment connection interface to allow change sets from the sandbox org to production. You have to make that available in the production org. So I flip back over to our left tab, and under deploy, down here under app setup on the left-hand nav, you click on deployment connections. Okay, so the first thing you'll see here is there are deployment connections that have been created for each sandbox that I have. So each sandbox, the develop, the QA, the other one that's still being created, it hasn't been listed yet. Now, just because the connections were created doesn't mean that we can actually transfer metadata or configuration between the production and sandbox org. In fact, if you see this red bar here and you see the tooltip, it'll actually tell you the Acme company cannot upload to development, and development cannot upload to Acme company. There's no connection yet. But if we go inside of this connection and edit it, we can simply say allow inbound changes. And we're going to click Save. So at this point, our developed sandbox is now allowed to send outbound change sets to the production org. And I'll show you a bit about that in a second. One thing to also note, even though it's not part of this demonstration flow, is, and we've got questions about this in the past, can you send information from the production org to the sandbox? And you can. These connections work sort of org agnostic. Really a sandbox org is just an org. A production org is just an org, and development connections allow you to move configurations between orgs. So if you want to do the flip, you would go to the sandbox org and say allow inbound changes from the production org. Now that we have our deployment connection set up, we can actually create a change set. So if we go back over to our sandbox, and again we're under setup here, we're going to go to deploy under app setup in the left-hand nav, and we're going to select outbound change sets. Now, for the sake of the demonstration, I've actually created all the ones that we're going to use here, and I've already uploaded them, but I'll walk you through it. So like I said, we wanted to deploy our first set of configurations. So that's the object, the Apex class, the Visualforce page. And that's all in this change set, Acme order first deploy. I'll click on that. Okay. So when you're in here, you can actually review the components that are in this change set. So you'll see our custom field, our custom object, our Apex class, and Visualforce page. Once you have everything in here that you need, you simply go up to the upload button, which is right here in the middle of the screen. You click upload, and what this will do, and I'm not going to go completely through this, is it will take you to a screen and ask you where you want it to go. So since the only deployment connection that's enabled for this is the production org, you would select the production org and hit upload. All right, so let me cancel out of this since I've already done the upload. Now, once you actually click the upload button, two things will happen on this page. You'll get a feedback directly in the page that says the upload was successful. That means that essentially the metadata upload has been in queue to be handled by our service. Once that's complete, you'll also get an email letting you know that the change set has been uploaded. Now, once we've gone through, since we've gone through and showed you how to upload a change set, one more thing I want to show you before we go back to the production org and deploy this stuff is just what it looks like to add a component to the change set. So I'm going to create a new change set, and we'll call this outbound deploy. And we save that, and after we save it, we have the option to add components to the change sets, and then you also have a separate option for adding profiles. So under change set components, I'm going to click on add, and then there's a drop-down list called component type. So this is a list of all the different types of configuration, metadata, code that exist in your org. So if I want to go through and add my custom object, I would scroll down to custom object, I would select that, and that would load all the custom objects that I've created. And then I can select Acme order, and I can add that to my change set so it's ready to be uploaded. Okay? All right, so let me cancel out of that. Now that you've seen how we create an outbound change set, how you add the components to it, and how to upload it, we'll go to our final step. The upload doesn't actually push the code and make it available in the production org. It just stages it in the production org. To actually deploy it, you need to go to inbound change sets, and again, I'm in my production org right now, and under deploy, you select inbound change sets. Now, from this screen, you can see all of the change sets that I've uploaded from the developed sandbox. And notice here you can see the source deployment connections. You can see where the change set came from. So we're going to go into our first change set, click into Acme order first deploy. Okay, we can verify the components that are there that we want to deploy right here under change set components. And then you simply click deploy. Click OK. And at this point, the custom objects, custom fields, the Apex class, and the Visualforce page are being added to my production org. Now you can see a status has been given that this change set has successfully deployed 4 components, and we can now go validate that these components were deployed correctly. So now we can see our Acme order custom object, and under develop, we can look at Apex classes. We can see that our Apex class has been added, as well as our Visualforce page. So this deployment step and this validation step are really the final step on how to do a simple deploy from Sandbox to your production org. It's pretty straightforward after you work through it. The interfaces are fairly intuitive, I would say. So first and foremost, again, I want to reiterate the small development shop with the profiled company that we're working with here. Minimal projects, minimal test environments. There isn't a major need to use desktop tools. So our recommendation is to stay in the browser. Doesn't mean you can't use the desktop tools. They're great. A lot of people like them, but our recommendation for this type of setup, stay in the browser. It brings consistency to how all of your system admins will work. We also suggest working as much with point-and-click dev, using dev console and change sets. Now, the second part might go without saying, but you must make time for testing and validation along with your customization. The people that are creating the things in the Sandbox should do functional testing first, and then once they are finished, then you should pass it off and allow the actual end business users to do validation to make sure things are working the way they expect. Now, another thing you should know about is Apex classes and code coverage. To move Apex code to production, we have specific criteria on how much test coverage that you need to have. So understand what that criteria is, and also understand that that criteria is only enforced when you're moving code to production. So for some of our customers out there, we've seen pitfalls where they've got multiple sandboxes, say they're using one for development and the other for QA. And they finish all their dev work and they're happy with it, but they haven't done everything they need to do in code coverage and test coverage. And they deploy the changes to the QA sandbox. Everything goes fine because we don't have that same criteria on that movement of metadata. And they come to find out when they then test everything there and try to push it to production, the deployment of the Apex class will fail. So make sure you're hitting all your test coverage. Unit testing is really important anyway, so we kind of enforce it through that. And finally, just to reiterate, and this will kind of take us into the next part of our demonstration, should always develop and test in the Sandbox if possible, not in production. So getting to the next part of our demonstration, we're going to continue iterating on our application. But in this segment, we're going to introduce what happens when multiple people start working in these orgs. So we're going to introduce a system admin with a little bit more of a cowboy mentality about development, someone who feels like they don't have to worry about who's in charge, and they'll just jump into the production org and make changes however they see fit. And then we'll also have an admin user in the Sandbox org doing what we would typically expect, working in the Sandbox first and creating their customization and doing a review and then creating the change set. So let's see what can kind of play out if this sort of scenario happens. So going back to our browser, okay, so this is our other system admin, James. Like I said before, James sees himself as kind of a brash developer and does what he wants. For some reason, in this case, James thinks it's okay for him to add the custom field development that he and his dev team talked about in the production org without approval. So let's just go ahead and start down this path and see what happens. So James is going to go over to setup under his name, and he's going to go down the left-hand nav and go to objects under create. He's going to go into Acme order, and he's going to start adding a custom field. Now in this case, James is unfortunately going to screw up and create a field that is has a data type of text, where the agreed upon field is actually decimal. he's going to add his field label, which is order amount. The length will be 10, that's fine. And then we'll go ahead and click next and finish out the creation of this custom field. Now, along with creating this custom field, let's pretend also that James then goes back to our Apex controller and integrates that code with this new text field on the Acme object. So that's great. He's proud of himself. Good for him. So now what happens if we go back to our other user? Well, like I said, in this scenario, there was already a dev meeting, and our original system admin is now working down in the Sandbox, and they happen to be working on the same thing. So I've already done this here, but I'll show you. If we go under Objects and look at Acme Order on the Sandbox, you can see that our other system admin has created a custom field called Order Price, which has the same intent as Order Amount. In this case, the field type or the data type is a number instead of a text field. And this system admin then integrates the controller, the Apex controller, to write to this particular Apex field. So this guy is done. He's finished everything. He's ready to go ahead and upload it. Let me show you the outbound change set. So under Deploy, I'll click on Outbound Change Set. And under Acme Order Second Deploy, you can see that we've added the Order Price custom field. Now, I've already uploaded this as well. So now if I am this system admin, I'm going to go back to my production org. I'm going to log in. I'm going to go back to setup. I'm going to find my inbound change sets in the production org. Now I see Acme Order Second Deploy. I'll click on that. I'll validate that order price is there, and I'll go ahead and deploy. Now, the interesting thing here is everything is successful. And this is where things can get a little bit hairy, because from his point of view, everything worked out right. Now when he goes to validate what's there, he'll go into Objects and look at Acme Order and notice that there's an extra field there. Now, how did that get there? What just happened? So this is a situation where you can actually overwrite each other if you're not coordinating with each other. Now, this isn't a catastrophic change, and assuming that the work that our original system admin did in the controller meets the needs of the entire order flow, things might have still worked out all right. But what this points out is an issue in their whole entire management of change and change control and whatnot. Let's talk about best practices for Salesforce development. You know that developing in production is something that you shouldn't do, but that isn't enough, really. You need to put the right tools and processes in place to keep things in check. So, as you can see, Salesforce gives you all the tools you need to develop code and then test that code and then move your changes to your production org. But it's up to you to make sure that this process runs smoothly. Now, we don't prescribe any specific release management process because, trust me, everyone has something different. Every customer out there has different products available, and even if they have the same products, and I'm talking about sandbox environments, things like that, they do it differently. So the only thing I can say here is that you need to have something. You need to have something out there that's written, documented, that your system admins or developers or whoever's getting in there, they know about this, and they stick to it. This is extremely important so you can avoid mishaps like the ones I just showed you. Now within that, or sort of wrapping that release management process, you need to have a well-documented project plan. Now again, we don't prescribe how you run projects. Here at Salesforce in our R&D department, we use agile methodologies based from Scrum. So maybe you're doing that. Maybe you're still doing waterfall, or maybe you have your own routine. But like release management, just have something in place. Last but not least, and this will also segue into the next part of our demonstration, have strict user governance. Okay? As you can see, we let this one user have access to the production org. Perhaps you want to take a very strict tact on this and not let any developers, except for your release manager, have system admin control. Okay? That way you can force all of them to work in your sandbox. Now, that might not be the best for you, but that's what I'm talking about when I say have strict user governance. Just make sure that your users have only the rights and permissions that they need, and understand, again, the difference between profiles of a user in Sandbox and production. You might not want to give them the same capabilities in both environments. All right, so that said, how do we control users? So in the next part of our demonstration, we're going to walk through how to create a permission set and deploy it to the production org. Permission sets and profiles are part of the org that allow us to control what a specific type of user can do. Now, through this exercise, we're going to show you some of the pitfalls associated in moving around permission sets and profiles, and there's a really important part to go through. So let's get back to our sandbox and start to create a permission set. So here's our permission set. It's called Account Manager. So Account Manager is something that we're going to use to ensure that any person that's assigned this permission set only has access to that new custom object we created. So if you're looking at a permission set, there's all different sorts of things you can do if you look under apps, but I've just modified some of the object settings, which, as it says, modifies permissions to access objects and fields. So if you click on Object Settings, I'm just showing you this so you can all see that in this particular permission set, this user would have no access to anything except for Acme orders. We worked on this permission set and we're happy with it. We're going to give everybody with this CRUD access to Acme orders. Great. So what's the next step? Well, just like you're working with any other metadata component, you're going to create an outbound change set, and I'll show you what that looks like. So here's Account Manager Deploy. Okay, if I scroll down, you can see, well, you simply add the Account Manager permission set. So that's simple enough. The change, the permission set was created. I've got my change set. I've uploaded it. Now I just have to go back to the production org and deploy it. So I'm back in my production org now, and I'm going to go under Deploy, back to Inbound Change Sets. I'm going to go into the Account Manager Deploy Change Set. Good, I can see that my permission set is there. That's fantastic. Now I'm going to, again, click Deploy. Now this will put the change set in my org, and absolutely it did. As you can see, succeeded. One component has been added. And let's do our validation step again. So under Manage Users, we'll click on Permission Sets. Great, you can see Account Manager is there. Now let's go in and take a look at it. Make sure everything is as we expect. So you click on Object Settings again, and look at that. Now, so we have an issue, okay? For some reason, the the constraints that we put around Acme orders hasn't come over. Now it's interesting because the account manager permission set came over, but why didn't the details related to Acme orders come over? Well, what just happened here? I mean, well, as it turns out, permission sets, and this is a hard way to say it, permission sets shouldn't be deployed alone. They can be deployed alone, but you may run into what we just saw, where you push something out and it's actually not connected to any of the related objects that you expect. Well, this is because, like I said, profiles and permission sets can be related to many objects and layouts. Because of this, you must explicitly add the metadata component and its related permission to the change set to ensure it deploys. So what we're saying here is you need to add the permission set, the account manager permission set, and the related metadata component, which would be the Acme object, the Acme order custom object, to the change set, just so the permission set deploys correctly. One thing to note here, and this is kind of outside of this, but if you looked into the XML using, say, like the native metadata API, and you looked at the payload of what we just deployed, you would actually notice that the permission set is completely empty. It's just a shell of what it should be. If you then did the same metadata API retrieve of the permission set and the Acme object, then the XML for the permission set would be complete as you expected. So this may seem kind of like a non-intuitive process, but we did it because it provides flexibility. So, like I said, when you create a permission set, one of the most normal use cases for a permission set is actually to add permissions around multiple objects or multiple layouts. So if you're actually working in your sandbox and you're working on a piece of functionality, say you are, like I said, say we worked on our Visualforce page and our Apex controller, and then we've got our Acme order thing, that's all done, and we want to put a permission around it, but at the same time, we've also been working on setting up permissions for other things that we're creating under the same account manager position. But we're ready just to deploy something. This gives you the ability to deploy just enough of the permission set as you want. Okay? So let me go back into the org and show you what the correct change set looks like. So under deploy in the production org, we look for our inbound change set again. And we'll look at the account manager deployed correct change set. And if you scroll down, you'll notice here that not only is the account manager permission set there, but so is the Acme order. Now if I deploy this, we should get what we want. Let's validate that very quickly by going down to Manage Users, Permission Sets, into Account Manager, Object Settings, and now you can see that the account manager type of user would have read, create, edit, delete, and modify all access. Now, a couple more things before we move on. Profiles and permission sets must be assigned in the production org. So what we're saying here is if you are testing out the permission set, assigning it to a user in the sandbox, that user assignment is not going to carry over when you move your permission set to the production org. You're going to have to reassign those once they get there. Also, a couple best practices, and this is coming from our product manager for permission sets and profiles. When it comes to layouts and record types, deploying layouts and record types within permission sets, the best case or the recommended practice is doing it in the production org. Now, I would absolutely preach to no end that the thing to do is to work in the sandbox first. But in some cases, for some things, you've got to work in the production org, and this is one of those cases. Finally, for more information, you'll see that link called "Dude, Where's My Permission?" That same product manager that I talked about, Adam Torman, wrote up a great blog post. This right here is a link to that, about profiles, permission sets, and the metadata API, and all the intricacies of how those work together. It's a really great blog post to get a little bit more in depth than what I'm doing right here. So we've walked through how to deploy components. We've walked through some of the pitfalls that you can get into without a structured process. We've also shown some special casing around what happens when you need to deploy a permission set. But what happens if you can't add your component to a change set? Well, it turns out that our metadata API, which change sets is built on, is not complete. There are some components that you just can't upload and deploy. Now, we're working on closing the gaps in the metadata API, and hopefully in the near future, it won't be this case. But right now, for minimal cases, you have to do a manual deployment. And what's a manual deployment? It's going into the production org and recreating what you've already created and tested in the sandbox. So, if you end up running into an unsupported metadata type, and there's a link showing you which ones are unsupported right here, our best practice is, again, have a process with change sets along your release management process, okay, and do as much as you possibly can with change sets first. Once that code is deployed and validated and everything is good, then go ahead and do your manual deployments and recreate those components that you've already tested and validated in your sandbox. Now, to wrap up, I have 2 more slides around some best practices. First of all, let's talk about release scheduling. Now, in my opinion, you should be planning your releases with knowledge of our release dates. You shouldn't think that it's just okay to set up your own release plan and just run through it unless you have all the knowledge of what's actually going on. So, a few things to note. If you're a system administrator, you will receive emails leading up to our Sandbox preview window and each of our major releases. And let me give you a quick description of what Sandbox preview is. Leading up to a major release, we'll actually upgrade a large set actually, of our Sandbox instances early to the next major release. If your Sandbox org, like in this case the one we're using called Develop, is on a preview enable instance, it will get upgraded as part of the preview, and then you have the ability to retest and validate your code and configurations and test out the new features and functionality and all that kind of stuff. So again, you'll get these emails coming in letting you know when these dates are. So write them down and plan around them if you need to. And I'll get to that in a second. And also, if you would like to get ahead of the game, you can reach out to your account exec, or if you are working with someone in professional services, or you have someone in support that you normally work with, you can work through them to get a list of our preview window dates and release dates ahead of time. Now, back to why should you do this? Well, I've seen a lot of different issues with customers when they don't coordinate these dates. And typically these are customers with conservative release plans, but they don't think about the major release. So in this particular case, let's say a customer decides to deploy within the preview window. Now, this could be just a couple minutes before the release. And if that's the case, you're actually deploying into the previous release when the new one is about to come out a couple weeks later, where you may, and this happens on an infrequent basis, but it does happen, run into some issues with some changes to features and functionality. Now, we know that's not your fault. You know, our changes should not break what you have. But in a small number of cases, this has happened. And you should be aware of that, because if you run a conservative release plan, then maybe you want to hold off from releasing during a preview window. Let the major release simmer for a couple weeks before you upload your next deployment. And think about things like that. Some customers have a really aggressive release plan. They can quickly deal with bugs or issues or things like that. So some are more aggressive and they don't think about it. But you should be aware of these dates. It's important. Last slide here is about managing your sandbox environment. And I haven't been able to touch on this too much, but there's a couple important things to note here. First of all, always refresh your sandbox after a release, but before you start your next release. When I say release, I'm not talking about our major release. I'm talking about when you deploy code. The reason you do that is when you deploy code into production, you're going to then go through validation steps again, and you're going to go through testing again and making sure everything is right. Once everything is perfect there, that is the exact baseline that you should be starting from to develop your next release. So always refresh. And finally, create a post-refresh run list. Run list is important because there's a lot of things that you still need to do after you create a sandbox. Perhaps your production org has integrations to other production systems. You need to redo those integrations and set them up to test environments. That should be documented. Sometimes you may need to turn off scheduled jobs. If you have scheduled jobs in your production environment, those things can get copied down to the sandbox, and they will fire off unless you turn them off. So you need to go in, shut them off, reconfigure things. Also, managing outbound email. There is some new features available in the sandbox to allow you to shut off email, only allow system-only email. This is important because sometimes email is integrated into scheduled tasks as well. And we've heard lots of issues about, oh, I turned on my sandbox and then every person in my production org got an email. That's not what you want. So make sure the default is that email is essentially turned off, so that thing shouldn't happen. But for special cases, if you're modifying your users in the sandbox, the user emails, the ones that say like, hey, your password is being reset, that's a system-only email, okay? That's what we have the sandbox set to as a default. So you would actually have to shut it off completely to make sure those don't go out. So have a run list. All right, so recapping, stay in the browser, always test and validate before you upload and deploy, have a change in release management process, maintain strict user governance, and integrate a post-refresh run list into that change management process. All right, so next steps. You can review the materials related to this presentation demonstration. All of the stuff is available on developer.force.com, as well as those the YouTube video will be on our social media area. Now, quickly talking about our next webinar, because I think I'm going a little slow here and we need to get to Q&A. The next webinar is dealing with a company profile where perhaps you have multiple production orgs, or maybe you have one main production org, but you have a host of different development environments at your fingertips. Maybe you have multiple development teams and projects. If that is your situation, then you're going to want to evolve from what we just showed you to what we'll be showing you in the next webinar. And in there we'll be highlighting Force.com migration tool, ant scripting, and source control. All right. We also have some upcoming events. There's a Salesforce API series on integrating applications with Force.com, as well as an application lifecycle management code talk, which will be very similar in content to what we're doing here today. I will be on that code talk, as well as my manager, Andrew Smith, who runs the Metadata API and tools related. And then, as you can see, there's a lot of good stuff coming up later on this year. So the first questions, someone made a comment that sometimes they find themselves making configuration changes in Salesforce thinking they're in the sandbox, but then they realize they're in the production org. And are there plans to make sandboxes stand out more from the production org? You know, I agree. Obviously, the interface that you're working with is exactly the same. The only difference you see is in the upper right-hand corner. If you're in a sandbox, it'll actually say sandbox and let you know the name of the sandbox that you're in. So right now, the best thing to do is just always make sure you verify where you're at by looking in the upper right-hand corner. Another thing to look at is to make sure you're in a sandbox. Every sandbox instance starts with CS and then some number. That's different than our production instances, which are based on region. All sandbox instances start with CS, so that's another checkpoint you can make. Hopefully in the future we'll have some time to look at maybe something a little bit more seamless to make sure you understand where you're at. There's a question that came in: can I limit the amount of data that gets copied over to Sandbox, like a filter criteria with date, until I want the data to be replicated? So this is a question about full Sandbox, because this is the only one that copies over data. So there's a couple things that we have in this area. So GA, there's a feature called Sandbox Templates, which you can use to define which object data you want copied over into your sandbox, into your full sandbox. It's not possible today to add filter criteria to that. If you're trying to limit the amount of data for a specific object, there's nothing out yet, but there's some good things coming down the road, and where we'll iterate and add more to this templates functionality. How many developer sandboxes can you create per org? Depends on how many licenses you have. We are, right now in Enterprise Edition, we give you one bundled, and if you buy some of our other products, then you get more developer sandboxes bundled with those add-on products. We're working on some things internally here, though, to give people more access to developer sandboxes. The specifics of that haven't completely been ironed out, but suffice it to say, in the future, if you're in need of a developer sandbox and it makes sense, you should be able to get them. Let's see, and that's if you're in E edition or above. Okay, another question. So it starts out with a comment: if it's a best practice for each developer to have their own dev sandbox, how do you suggest dealing with the conflicts of shared resources? For example, two developers are working on different items, but both need to touch an account trigger control class. If both add a line of code to the class and deploy to Q&A, right. So when it comes to managing changes when you're working in multiple sandboxes, that's sort of the evolution that we're going to get to in the next webinar, where I'm going to recommend integrating with source control, and hopefully we can show you how to, mitigate those, synchronizing issues and things like that with a source control system. If you don't have access to that, then I would say the next best thing to do is like I said, it's not what our ideal case is, but if you have a set of people that are working on shared functionality, then maybe for your group, it's easier to just have them work in the same sandbox, so they can see when one changes and someone else makes a change. Can you show how to set up those connections in prod and dev org for deployment? So I think what we're talking about is the deployment connections again, and simply put, if you want to switch the polarity, you just go to the destination org to allow inbound chain sets from the source org. So if your source org happens to be prod and the destination org is your dev sandbox, then you go to the dev sandbox org and modify the deployment connections there. Okay? If the target org is production and the source org is the sandbox, then it's like what I demonstrated already. Is there a concept of versioning of releases in code in Salesforce, like traditional software development? No, we do not have that right now. But with, like I said, with the next webinar and integration with source control, you can create your own type of versioning. Is it possible to copy a sandbox from a full instance? And I think what we're saying here is, in the normal sandbox copy process, we're always copying the production org information. And I've talked to a lot of different customers about what this question is about. Well, what if I want to make a copy from a sandbox org instead of the production org? And so the source of the copy is a sandbox org. Honestly, this is a great idea, and this is a feature that I do want to provide in the future. There are some things that we're doing internally right now where we're kind of really messing with the guts of Sandbox Copy Engine. And when we're done with that, I think we will absolutely look into scheduling this type of feature enhancement. It's a great idea, and it'll help with a lot of different cases, not just copying from a full sandbox. Thank you all for your time. I appreciate it. I hope that you got a lot of great information out of this. All right, cheers, everyone. Thank you.